the planned surrender of Australia. So perhaps we might start by plunging right in by raising a question called the new international economic order. Now, if you listen to the critics of the League, of course, that's just simply a product of Eric Butler or his colleagues' overheated imagination. The idea there's any sort of a program like that is too silly for words. Well, let us look just at hard facts. Let us first start with the Australian Labor Party's own platform. And in that Australian Labor Party platform, you can read in black and white that that particular political party is pledged to incorporate Australia into the new international economic order, which means, in essence, that our total economy must be incorporated into a global economy. And if you are following this and can understand the double talk, you'll be listening to Senator Button. Senator Button keeps telling you we've got to restructure the Australian economy, both primary industry and secondary industry. That's one of the new buzzwords, restructuring. What does that mean? It means progressively phasing out some sections of our economy, amalgamating other parts of our economy to fit it into an international order. That's what it's all about. So it's no secret as far as the Labor Party is concerned. There it is in their platform. Well, of course, at that stage, the dedicated party devotees immediately say, well, that's horrible, that's terrible. They are engaged in the program of surrendering part of our sovereignty. We must get rid of them. We must bring in the opposition. Now, there's only one problem about that, my friends. There is no opposition. Because, you see, I don't care whether you speak about Mr. John Howard or you speak about Mr. Peacock, they're all dedicated to the same program and have said so. And if you've forgotten, I must remind you that for 7 years, up and down this country, a man who many people believe was a Conservative Prime Minister, Mr. Malcolm Fraser, preached the virtues of the new international economic order. He didn't exactly call it that. He spoke about something called the North-South Dialogue. But translated into English, that meant that Australian economy must be restructured to fit it into the new international economic order. Well, you can go back a little further, and of course, formally you might say this part of the program really emerged in the open back in 1974. In 1974, Dr. Henry Kissinger, that high-powered spokesman for those groups we'll look at it a little later who really exercise power in this world, the great international banking groups, he gave a tremendous address, a keynote address of that holy of holies called the United Nations. And in essence what Dr. Kissinger said was this: the problems of the world now are so great, the problems of all the nations of the world are so great that no individual nation can solve these problems on its own anymore. What we've got to do is to internationalise the program. In other words, if you can't solve a problem on a small scale, the thinking is if you make it big enough, in essence you'll find a solution, which is quite a strange way of looking at a problem, which to me is rather like saying to the alcoholic, there's only one solution: increase the consumption of alcohol and you'll eventually get somewhere. Now that address was given and the United Nations formally agreed. All members voted for it. The Australian representative put his hand up. What about the Soviet Union? They voted for it. In fact, the Soviet Union said, in essence, this idea had been thought of a long time earlier by a chap called Lenin. He actually, they said, was the father of the idea. All that the rest of the world was doing was catching up now. What about that country very much in the news at the moment? Communist China. They're also for the new international economic order. So you see, there is a program. You can look, for example, at great international bodies like the Trilateral Commission. Now, the Trilateral Commission is three major groups, headed currently by David Rockefeller of the great Chase Manhattan Banking Group, and they are pledged to advance the cause of the new international economic order, which in essence is that we internationalise the economies of the world. And Lenin was correct when he said you can't create a world state unless you first of all got a world economy. That's the foundation. You must destroy the economic independence of all the member states of the United Nations before you can establish the world state. And they're quite right when they say that. So the new international economic order can be studied and read. The great tragedy about it, of course, you'll often find politicians who will assure you, like Senator Boswell and others, that it's all a figment of Eric Butler or someone else's imagination. There's no such program, which in essence seems to mean that we're all going the one direction just by bad luck or chance. There's no program behind it. The truth is there is a program. And we shouldn't be surprised about that program. Because what we're discussing, ladies and gentlemen, is an idea as old as man. And so tonight I want to take you back a little in history. I want to cover quickly, in a broad sweep, some of the aspects we've got to get our minds around. And so we've got to start with what I call a few absolutes. One of the absolutes concerns the subject of power. Now, ever since there have been human beings on this world, some of them wanted power. They still want power. You see it every day. The will to power. That's as old as man, starting, as I said, with Alexander the Great, right up to the Soviet Union, other groups wanting power. Now, the absolute power is, of course, the one that we're warned about by the great Lord Acton when he said that all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That is an absolute. Now, it's not very fashionable today to talk about absolutes. So I must make it quite clear here, ladies and gentlemen, I believe in absolutes. I believe that 2 and 2 still equals 4. I believe there are absolute